you know this year is the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the State of Israel? 70 is one of those numbers that has a hold on the imagination, as any reader of the Bible knows. It doesn't have a particular hold on me, but like many historians, I see anniversaries as opportunities to remind people of what they've forgotten and perhaps instruct them about things that they've never known. So 2017 gave us a string of anniversaries, important ones: the centenary of the Balfour Declaration, right, 1917, the 70th anniversary of the UN partition vote of 1947, the 50th anniversary of the Six-Day War of 1967. All of these anniversaries generated a great deal of new research, some new insights. I myself wrote major essays about 1917 and 1947. And now we've come upon this year's 70th anniversary of Israel. And so I decided to devote this year to researching and writing on this subject. Now, this is a kind of a prelude to a series of lectures that I'll be giving in New York in the summer on Israel's Declaration of Independence. But we're still at the beginning of the year. My ideas aren't totally formulated in their final form. So please treat this as a kind of a work in progress. It's an excellent time to give me feedback, which I can incorporate in my final products. And if you can catch me in an error, that's even better. Now, the events of 1948, like those of any great year of independence, are remembered selectively. And sometimes they're encrusted with myths. And this is especially so when independence is combined with war. The two processes unfold simultaneously. You have state formation and war making going on at the same time. And I think there's no more potent combination for a confused chronology and exaggerated claims. Now, Israel is a prime example of independence combined with war, as is the United States. Naturally, the war preoccupied Israel's leaders, and it's also preoccupied historians. The most important historians of 1948 are essentially military historians. Think of Benny Morris. His book, 1948, is a military history above all. It's probably the most influential book on 1948. Another, maybe some of you from an older generation remember Van Kurtzman's Genesis, which was also a history of 1948. Both books, by the way, had exactly the same subtitle: The First Arab-Israeli War. I myself contributed to this military history a few years ago. The truth be told, I'm not a military historian by training. I'm not even a historian of Israel. I was trained by Bernard Lewis in the history of Islam. But in 2014, I read Ari Shavit's best-selling book, My Promised Land, and especially its most celebrated chapter on the Israeli conquest of Lydda in July 1948. How many of you recall reading that book and that chapter? A fair amount of hands are up. His account seemed to me totally contrived, so I wrote a refutation of it. I ended up in an exchange lasting 2 rounds, not with Shavit, who deigned not to respond to me, but to Benny Morris, who did, and which you'll find featured in this book, which was mentioned by Ed, The War on Error. Now, one of the things I discovered in the process is that it's very easy to distort the history of 1948 and to get away with it. Who among the historians of 1948 openly questioned Ari Shavit's account of Lydda? He went from prize to prize, including a National Jewish Book Award in history. And if you remember the issue there, he claimed that there had been a massacre in Lydda. In my article, I show that there was not a massacre, but a battle. Now, I want to add that in Israel itself, vulnerability to fake history is growing deeper. And here I speak as a former college president, a liberal arts college. The humanities in Israel are in a free fall, and to judge from a new report by Israel's Central Bureau of Statistics. In 1984, 23% of undergrads studied humanities. Today, it's about 8%. And while Jewish studies seem to be holding up, not so the Israel-specific departments, such as the history of Israel, Hebrew, and so forth, Hebrew literature. Since 1984, while Israel's population has doubled, the number of students majoring in the history of Israel has dropped by more than half. And I see the results as a teacher. I sense a decline in general knowledge of Israeli history among younger Israelis. It's just a statistical fact that they're much less likely to be corrected by a teacher or a parent or a peer really knowledgeable about history, which leaves them vulnerable to historical misrepresentations and gross errors. So this is why I decided, in the wake of the Shavit episode, that I'd make more of a difference in the study of Israeli history than in the study of contemporary Islam, at least for the time being. And this year, as I said, my focus is on 1948. Now, I mentioned that 1948 is largely the preserve of military historians, probing Israel's military decisions. I found that there's much less about the politics. And what I'd like to do in my remarks today is to examine 3 instances associated with votes that show the politics of 1948 in a different light. Now, I've called this talk 3 Votes. We've just come off the anniversary of the vote, right? What is the vote? The 1947 General Assembly vote for the partition of Palestine. Now, one of the most remarkable things about that vote, which, by the way, was reenacted on the occasion of the anniversary in New York in the very building, now the Queen's Museum, where it originally took place, is that it took place in front of cameras, right? Of course, lots took place behind the scenes, events that have to be reconstructed from a variety of sources. I myself published a very long essay back in November about the Soviet role in that vote, which has been much forgotten. But we also have a filmed record of the vote and a precise accounting of who stood for what. Regarding the votes taken by the Zionist leaders themselves, there's a lot more confusion. We have to work from very deficient minutes of meetings and cut through layers of legend and spin. But I want to present to you today the story of 3 votes by Jews, which were just as crucial as the formation of Israel, to the formation of Israel as we know it, as any vote in the United Nations. The UN vote, we may say, licensed a Jewish state. But the votes by Jews, by the Zionist leaders, determined its form. And let me briefly list the 3 votes, and then I'll discuss each of them in chronological order. The first took place on May 12, 1948, 2 days before Israel's declaration of independence. The standard story is that there was a vote in the People's Administration. This is the People's Administration in session, which was a kind of proto-cabinet. Before the state was created, a proto-cabinet and a proto-Knesset, known as the People's Council, were created by the Zionist executive. And according to the standard view, the People's Administration convened to decide whether or not to declare independence. But the evidence for such a vote even taking place is questionable. However, another vote did definitely take place at this session. It was decided not to delineate the borders of Israel in the Declaration of Independence, which is a decision that was carried by only 1 vote, 5-4. This proved to be crucial. Although Israel was licensed to come into existence according to a map, right, the UN Partition Map, and we'll see it in a moment, its founders, Israel's founders, decided that that map wouldn't bind them. And as we'll see, this was a win for David Ben-Gurion. The second vote took place on September 26, 1948. We're already closer to the end of the war, and we're in the cabinet of Israel's first provisional government. You see it here. The question now is this: where should the IDF stop? By this time, it probably had the military capability to occupy all of Jerusalem and the West Bank. In a narrow vote, 7-6, the cabinet chose to rein in the IDF and to stop. This, too, was a crucial decision. It left the old city of Jerusalem in Arab hands, left Israel with that long green line demarcating the West Bank from Israel. And as we'll see, this vote was shrouded in some mystery, and its consequences would be a source of regret to many. Ben-Gurion would describe that vote as a lament unto the generations. And now I'm going to confess to some cheating. The third vote didn't take place in 1948. It took place in the Israeli cabinet on December 11, 1949. By now, Israel has reached armistice agreements with its enemies, establishing armistice lines. Jewish West Jerusalem is included in these lines, but Jerusalem isn't the capital of Israel. The government and the Knesset meet in Tel Aviv. But as 1949 draws to a close, the United Nations General Assembly begins to pass a resolution to reassert the provision in the 1947 partition plan that Jerusalem should be an internationally administered zone. It's called a corpus separatum. Israel's government counters with a decision, with only one member dissenting. Jerusalem is declared the capital of Israel. By the way, there was a mistake in Trump's first reference to this when he said that Jerusalem had been Israel's capital since 1948. For the first year and a half, it was not. Ben-Gurion drove this decision, and as I'll show, it has undeniable parallels to President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Now, why is this history important? By the spring of 1948, the creation of the Jewish state couldn't be stopped. This is the partition map of 1947. How it would fare in war was an open question, but there would be a Jewish state. But the question was, where would it be? There was a legitimizing framework for the state, the 1947 partition map, which accompanied the 1947 partition plan. It was drawn up by a UN committee. But it wasn't the map the Zionists drew. And as you can see, it was a chessboard map. It excluded Zion, Jerusalem, from the Jewish state. Remember, according to this map, Jerusalem is an internationally administered zone, and as you'll see, it's totally surrounded by the orange, which is the Jewish state, which is the Arab state. So should Israel adhere to this map? Should Israel seek to alter it? And if so, how? The votes that answered these questions created the realities on the ground that Israelis live in today. What's remarkable is that the first two votes, those of 1948, were decided by the narrowest of margins. It's a reminder that history is made up of choices, but also no small measure of luck. The British evacuation of Palestine. It's May 12, 1948, and the People's Administration convenes in Tel Aviv. In this proto-cabinet, we have the leaders of the mainstream political parties in the Yishuv at the time. Let's recall the context of events. The previous year, Britain had announced that it would be leaving Palestine and turn the whole question over to the United Nations. In November 1947, as we saw, the UN General Assembly passes a resolution by a two-thirds majority in favor of partitioning the country into Jewish and Arab states. The Yishuv, at least most of it, celebrated, because since the time of Herzl, the aim of political Zionism is the creation of a Jewish state. Palestine's Arabs, supported by Arabs elsewhere, rejected the resolution. And since then, from November 1947 onward, a civil war had raged between Jews and Arabs, even as the British prepared for their final departure, which they set for May the 15th. Now, the fighting that began already in November had alarmed many in the international community. And their alarm grew when the Arab states surrounding Palestine announced that they would be coming to the aid of the Palestinian Arabs after the British left. So now we're talking about Arab states, not just the Palestinian Arabs. A regional war seemed likely. And so by the spring of 1948, some of the governments which had backed the partition plan in November began to backtrack. And which was the most important of those governments which was backtracking? The government of the United States. The estimate of the Pentagon and the CIA was that if the Arab states invaded, then they would defeat the Yishuv. The United States would then come under political pressure to intervene to save it. So it was better to stop the deterioration by foregoing partition and putting the country under a UN trusteeship. This was the American plan, a UN trusteeship, which would be a continuation of a mandate. The mandate was the League of Nations. Now we had the United Nations, and the equivalent in the United Nations was trusteeship. First, there would be a UN-implemented ceasefire, and then a trusteeship administration. In short, the mandate would be prolonged and a Jewish state deferred. And this was the U.S. position from about March of 1948 onwards. And the United States made this position quite clear to the leaders of the Yishuv, as well as to its American Zionist supporters right up to the eve of the British departure. Here you see U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall and Israel's Prime Minister, first Prime Minister Moshe Shertok, later Sharet. There was a very famous meeting between these two men that took place on May 8th, 1948. Okay, so we're 4 days before the vote that I'll be discussing, and we are 7 days before the Declaration of Independence. Marshall began by acknowledging that the Jewish forces had already had a string of victories. He was right about that. The Jews had taken and held not just territory that had been allotted to the Jewish state, but also some areas allotted for the Arab state as well. But Marshall dismissed this as a temporary success, as he put it. And he warned Shertok that in the longer term, there was no assurance that the tide might not turn against the Jews. And I quote Marshall on this point. "I told Mr. Shertok," he said, "that they were taking a gamble. If the tide did turn adversely and they came running to us for help, they should be placed clearly on notice now that there was no warrant to expect help from the United States, which had warned them of the grave risk which they were running." End of quote. That was George Marshall to Moshe Shertok. So the message was, don't risk everything, postpone your state, accept a ceasefire. If you go ahead with your gamble and you lose it, don't expect salvation from us. Now, there's a story that many in Israel and elsewhere believe that this plunged the leaders of the Yishuv into doubt, that they were frightened by the prospect of defeat and that they wavered. After all, until now, they'd only faced Palestinian Arab militia. If they declared the state, they'd face an invasion by Arab states such as Egypt and Transjordan and Iraq, and these had conventional armed forces. They'd been armed and trained by the British over many years. So the Americans were proposing a ceasefire. Perhaps it would be sensible to accept it and postpone the state. And according to the same story, it was David Ben-Gurion who beat back the doubters, and only just barely. Now, I call this the Moses narrative of the birth of Israel. The people of Israel have been told to leave Egypt, right? But they hesitate. You know the story. They express doubt. Aren't the risks too great? What if the sea doesn't part? Isn't the desert perilous? Isn't the promised land inhabited by giants? It's Moses who sort of bucks up the people of Israel single-handedly. So let's see how the Moses narrative became inserted in the story of Israel's independence. In particular, the May 12th meeting at the People's Administration. Now, I'm going to introduce you to someone you've probably never heard of, even if you are a close student of Israel's history. Have a look at this photograph. You'll see Ben-Gurion on the left, alongside someone who's holding up Israel's freshly signed Declaration of Independence. Now, who is this man? His name was Ze'ev Sherf, and he was the secretary to the various agencies involved in transitioning to the state. He became Israel's first cabinet secretary. Later, he would become a government minister. Sherf's job as secretary was to keep the minutes of meetings. It was Sherf who kept the minutes of the meeting of the People's Administration on May 12, 1948. And later, they served as the basis for a chapter in a book he published in 1959 on the birth of Israel. And there's a translation into English, and it's called 3 Days. Now, for years, this account was the inside source for the history of what happened in that historic meeting, which lasted for 11 hours until past midnight. It is a fascinating account which more or less tracks the minutes of the meeting. It wasn't until the 1970s that the minutes were released to the public, so he was relying on the minutes himself, which the public could not see. Lots of issues were discussed at that meeting. I can't cover them all. Jerusalem was under siege at the time, and much of the debate focused on the city under siege. In fact, two of the members of the People's Administration couldn't attend the meeting because they couldn't leave Jerusalem. Certainly the most dramatic moment came when Yigal Sukenik, was later Yigal Yadin, gave the meeting his estimate of the military situation. He was the chief of military operations for the Haganah, and he would later become chief of staff of the IDF. He assessed that if the Arab armies invaded, the new state would have a 50-50 chance of surviving. He'd have been happier, he said, if the end of the mandate were 2 months away, not 2 days away. Yadin would later say that he thought he'd given an upbeat presentation. Golda Meir remembered it otherwise. Ben-Gurion then made a compelling case against the risks of delay. A state, he said, could be much more effective in mobilizing the war effort. It could issue orders, not just implore people to do things on a voluntary basis. And it could take advantage of the present disorganization in Arab ranks. Now, Zev Sharaf, the secretary, wrote in his book that after this marathon session of 11 hours, and I quote him, a vote was taken. It was decided by 6-4 to reject the proposal for a truce. Acceptance would imply postponing the declaration of the state. Rejection by the raising of hands meant ipso facto that in 2 days' time, the state would come into formal being. End of quote. And this is the account that has gone down in history as the standard version. It went into the canonical Sefer Toldot HaHaganah, the main history of the Haganah for this period, where it became an assumed fact. At about the same time, it was dramatized in Dan Kurtzman's book Genesis, which might be described as history in the remaking. Now, I'll give you a flavor of his treatment with this passage, in which he discusses it. He says, and he's quoting Ben-Gurion, he says, and now we will vote on whether to accept the armistice proposal, Ben-Gurion declared. Had he made them understand? Could they hear the whispers of the faint-hearted millions who had perished? Desperately, he tried to exclude from his own mind the stuttering, painfully revealing ambiguity of the testimony of his military experts. End of quote. So Kurtzman had this amazing power. He could even peer into Ben-Gurion's thoughts, as he did in this passage. In a much more restrained form, the story appears in the New Encyclopedia of Israel and Zionism. It's in Amud Ha'esh, which is this documentary film series, which every Israeli has seen. It's on the website of the Israeli Foreign Ministry. The late Shabtai Tevet, the biographer of Ben-Gurion, and my dear friend, repeated it at length. Walter Lacour, another friend, included it in his history of Zionism. It's been repeated by another friend, the historian Ilan Troen. I quote him, Ben-Gurion had to apply the full force of his personality and position to achieve this slight majority in favor. It was clearly his influence that made the difference at this critical moment in Jewish history. The duration of the meeting and the closeness of the decision reflect the reality that declaring an independent Jewish state, however deeply desired and justified, was a prospect that engendered great foreboding. End of quote. Now, the late historian Tzvi Tzahol, he went the furthest. He claimed that of the 10 members of the People's Administration who attended that meeting, 9 entered the room disposed to accept the ceasefire and postpone the state, and only Ben-Gurion thought otherwise. But in the course of the day, he turned all this around into a vote 6 in favor. And finally, the most recent example from a very fine book by my colleague, Daniel Gordis, his Israel, A Concise History of a Nation Reborn. And Danny writes, and I quote him, by a slim margin of 6-4, the People's Administration voted in Tel Aviv on May 12, 1948, to declare the first sovereign Jewish state since Judea had fallen 2 millennia earlier. End of quote. Now, it sounds quite dramatic. After all, if one vote had shifted, imagine, there would have been a tie. All right? And what would have happened then? This is the first page of the protocol, the minutes of that meeting. There's a problem here. If you read the minutes, you'll find that there isn't a mention of a vote. Now, obviously, the minutes of an 11-hour meeting won't include everything said in that meeting. Sheriff included what he thought was important. But the plain fact is that the vote isn't there. Second, there are differing accounts as to who voted how. Notice that Sheriff, and I brought the quote, didn't say who voted for and who voted against. Historians have filled in the blanks on the basis of lore or speculation, how they think the members would have voted, but they've not reached identical conclusions. The story is also absent from places where you would expect it to be present. Ben-Gurion's diary doesn't mention it. As we'll see, he mentioned another disagreement among the members and another vote. But as for declaring independence, his entry in his diary is very laconic, and I'll quote it. In the afternoon, a meeting of the People's Administration, it was decided to declare statehood and a provisional government at 4 in the afternoon on Friday. That's it. Chertok, in his diary, said the decision not to delay was unanimous. Right? No vote is mentioned. In 1969, a then young historian named Mordechai Naor wanted to clarify who voted which way. I say it's not mentioned in Sheriff's account. So he wrote to Ben-Gurion, and this is the answer that the old man gave him. This is 1969, so more than 20 years after the fact. I'm quoting Ben-Gurion. In the protocols in my possession, there is no such resolution, and I do not know what basis you believe that 6 voted against it and 4 in favor. Therefore, I cannot tell you the names of those against and those in favor, because there was no vote, according to the material in my possession. End of quote. In 1973, the Encyclopedia Judaica appeared, and you may not know it, but the entry on the Declaration of Independence was written by David Ben-Gurion. There's no mention of the vote, although there's mention of another vote that I'll come to immediately. So the preponderance of evidence began to point to the possibility that there had been no vote, that Scharf had made an error in recalling events 10 years after their occurrence. He wrote his book in 1959. Here he is. One historian finally went to Scharf and pointed out that no vote appeared in the protocol, in the minutes. According to that historian, and I quote him, he's since passed away, Scharf was astonished and at a loss when he discovered he had erred. We discussed this a few times without reaching a solution, but when I found a reasonable explanation and asked to present it to him, he fell ill and died shortly later. A great loss. So today, if you now visit Independence Hall on Rothschild Avenue, which is preserved as a museum, the explanatory brochure that's on sale notes the controversy, and its author, who is a prolific historian, then adds, and I quote him, "I wish to add my own humble voice to those who deny that any vote was taken." Now, why wouldn't there have been a need for a vote? Well, because it was obvious that the Arabs wouldn't accept a ceasefire anyway. Because the public waited in expectation of a state. Because of fear of a legal vacuum at the end of the British mandate. Because Menachem Begin threatened to proclaim a state if Ben-Gurion did not. And because Chertok understood from various connections in Washington and New York that Marshall's warning wasn't America's final word, and that Truman was more favorably disposed to an Israeli declaration, which proved to be true in the end. America immediately recognized Israel upon declaration of the state. So in the end, even though some members of the People's Administration were alarmed by the situation, they didn't have an alternative plan, an alternative path forward. So there wasn't need for a vote. Yes, there was discussion, there was concern. There may even have been a straw vote. I don't rule out the possibility when it's the raising of hands. Anyone who's been on the board knows that there are 2 different kinds of votes. There's a vote where you have the roll call and you write the name of each person on each side of the issue. And there's a straw vote, a raising of hands. It's not impossible that at some moment there was some kind of raising of hands. But although there was discussion and there was concern, there was no wavering. So the Moses narrative with Ben-Gurion in the starring role developed later, over time, along with Ben-Gurion's ascent to this mythic status after 1948. But the story of the vote rests on a shaky foundation. But the real choice that the People's Administration did face was what sort of state to declare. Not whether to declare a state, but what sort of state. Would it be a state in the framework of the UN partition plan? That would be the most legitimate form, right? 2/3 had voted for the partition plan in the United Nations. The most likely to win international recognition. But then if it was in the UN framework, that would mean accepting the borders according to the partition plan, right? The borders we saw earlier, the chessboard. On the other hand, if the state was created only on the basis of the UN partition plan, that would leave maximum flexibility. The question then was whether or not to delineate the borders of Israel in the declaration. And here Ben-Gurion was adamant. The UN, he said, had done nothing to implement its plan. The Arabs had declared war on Israel. They had torn up the map. And I quote him from the minutes of that meeting. "We accepted the UN resolution, but the Arabs did not. They are preparing to make war on us. If we defeat them and capture the Western Galilee," which was supposed to go to the Arab state, "or territory on both sides of the road to Jerusalem," which was supposed to be part of the Arab state, "these areas will become part of the state, the Jewish state. Why should we obligate ourselves to accept boundaries that in any case the Arabs do not accept?" And then he went on to point out that the United States hadn't defined its borders when it declared independence. It was this vote that Ben-Gurion always mentioned as the crucial decision on May 12th. The vote does appear in the minutes, 5-4 against delineating the borders, and the minutes list the names of who voted for and who voted against. In that Encyclopedia Judaica article, Ben-Gurion also names those who opposed him, and then he adds, by a 5-4 majority, it was decided not to specify frontiers. So this is the vote on May 12th that made Israel. As Sheriff wrote, it meant that if, and I quote him, "if the state were to be brought into existence by force of arms, then its putative frontiers would have to be determined by the same means." And that meant that Israel would claim every territory that it had already conquered and any territory that it would conquer. It was Ben-Gurion who determined that Israel would be a state without borders, and by invoking the American example, hinted at future expansion. This is a situation as we get into the fall of 1948. You can see that already the Jewish state is in possession of some of the areas which are allocated to the Arab state, most notably in the north, Western Galilee, and the way up to Jerusalem. Not yet all of the Negev, though, which had been earmarked for the Jewish state by the partition plan. And that brings me to the second vote on September 26, 1948. Now, as I said, by this point, Israel clearly has the upper hand in the war. There is presently a pause in the fighting. And the question is, in which direction should Israel press its advantage once the fighting resumes? At this point, the IDF has not taken the Negev, which was allotted to the Jewish state in the partition plan, and the Egyptian forces are still there, and pushing them out will require a major effort. But there's another possible direction, eastwards. Earlier, the Arab Legion had repelled these repeated Israeli assaults on Latrun on the way to Jerusalem, and of course the Legion had taken the old city of Jerusalem and the Jewish quarter and the Western Wall. But perhaps this time around, one more attack, and it might be different. On September 26, Ben-Gurion went to what was then the provisional government to propose another assault on Latrun. But it would be more than that. As part of this campaign, and I quote the minutes of that meeting, and this is Ben-Gurion, "it would be possible to move the eastern central border much deeper, if not past the mountain crest," that's the mountain crest of the West Bank, "then at least up to it, so that the coastal strip won't be so narrow. We can move the Jezreel Valley very much further south, if not to Nablus. We can widen the corridor to Jerusalem, at least to Ramallah, so that the line from Bir Nabala," that's near, some of you going up to 443 highway, this is the route he's talking about. Bir Nabala to Ramallah will be in our hands. So it's not clear from this just how far Ben-Gurion was prepared to push. But even in this limited conception, much of the West Bank would have been absorbed into Israel already in 1948. Already in 1948. But this proposal met stiff resistance from several key members of the cabinet. They fretted that another attack on Latrun would fail, that Israel would be punished internationally for pressing the war still further beyond the partition borders, that it would put many more Arabs, some of them already refugees, under Israeli rule. When the proposal was put to a vote, Ben-Gurion's plan was rejected. 7-6. 7-6. One of the 7 against was Chertok, who had to leave the meeting before the vote, but who left a piece of paper with his vote on it. Now, historians have been very perplexed by this outcome, because usually when Ben-Gurion wanted something, he did the groundwork. He came up with a practical plan, and he lobbied all of the main actors in advance. In this case, he did nothing. And this has led to speculation that he himself was of two minds about it. And it isn't difficult to list the possible reasons for hesitation, in addition to the ones raised by his opponents, which I just mentioned. Had Israel moved then to take the West Bank, it might have provoked the British to come to Transjordan's defense. It would have certainly undermined any understandings with King Abdullah, although there's debate whether any such understandings ever held. And the addition of many more Arabs would have threatened Israel's Jewish majority then, although in 1948 they might have fled and not stayed. But there are two interesting twists to this story. After 1949, when the armistice lines were settled, right, you remember the map of Israel after 1949, a growing course in the IDF held that an opportunity was missed in 1948. The so-called Green Line was long and it was porous. Israel's heartland was vulnerable to cross-border attacks. And the result was a series of retaliatory escalations. And of course, Jerusalem became a city divided by barbed wire, while the Jews were denied access to their holy places. Yigal Allon, who was the former commander of the Palmach, made the most insistent criticism of the way the war ended. Let me quote him. This is from 1951 or so. This is Yigal Allon. "Our main failure was in stopping some of our offenses prematurely and in not initiating additional and crucial military operations. This was especially true with regard to the final stage of the war, when we had the opportunity to annihilate our enemies, earn the right to greater Israel, and still be able to reach a lasting peace under ceasefire agreements. All of these were in the reach of the IDF at the time. Major diplomatic difficulties caused our government to retreat from fighting for greater Israel and widening the current not-quite borders, leaving the enemy in military bases within the land of Israel. But the consequences of those political and diplomatic considerations placed Israel in apparent and permanent danger. All too often, one might worry whether we won the battle and lost the peace." This is Yigal Allon in 1951, right? Lamenting the way in which the 1948 war ended. Here is Chertok and Ben-Gurion. Well, this is a very biting criticism of the end of the war, and Allon wasn't the only one to make it. Ben-Gurion was the implied target of this criticism, and it stung him. Sometimes he dismissed it. Israel didn't need more territory. It needed to focus on absorbing immigrants, building the country. But at times he did express regret that East Jerusalem remained in Arab hands. And sometimes he emphasized that he wasn't to blame. Right? He proposed taking the West Bank, but he'd been thwarted by others, above all Chertok. I mentioned Chertok earlier. He was Ben-Gurion's rival in the Mapai party, and while they'd worked together quite well in earlier years, by the 50s they were at loggerheads. Ben-Gurion much later even described the failure to take the West Bank in 1948 as one that would be lamented for generations, for which others were responsible, above all Chertok. Now, the other twist is that Chertok was known to have said that if he'd known that his vote would have been decisive, he would have voted otherwise. Right? While he opposed a large-scale offensive on the West Bank, he would have supported an assault on Latrun, which could have conceivably moved further into further stages. So had Chertok stayed for the actual vote, instead of leaving a note, right, perhaps the outcome would have been different. The vote of September 26, 1948 left a double legacy. It left the West Bank in Arab hands, and solidly Arab, but it also created an Israeli version of the stab in the back. That the politicians had stopped the military from doing what they could and should have done. And this fed discontent with the post-1949 status quo, a discontent that came to fruition in 1967, when Ben-Gurion himself was happy to declare that the lament of generations hadn't even lasted one generation. I come now to the last vote. These are the minutes of the Knesset, to which I'll refer. It's a more straightforward case, and I've already laid out the basic parameters. On December 11th, 1949, the Israeli cabinet voted to designate Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And the Knesset followed suit immediately thereafter. Now, prior to that, Tel Aviv had served as the de facto capital. But on December 9th, it was 2 days before this vote, the General Assembly, UN General Assembly resolved, and I quote this General Assembly resolution, the UN declared its intention that Jerusalem should be placed under a permanent international regime and shall be administered by the United Nations. End of quote. Now, Chertok, who was foreign minister at the time, hadn't even seen this coming. In Israel, it caused very deep consternation. Israel's position in Jerusalem was still not recognized by anyone. And Ben-Gurion decided to act decisively by establishing a fait accompli. To keep Jerusalem in Israel, he decided it had to be made Israel's capital. It was a reactive move. There was no groundswell of opinion in favor of moving the capital to Jerusalem. Jerusalem could just as easily have served as a spiritual capital. Abba Eban once said that he never heard in the period from independence to the end of 1949 anyone talk about Jerusalem as capital. But the UN move changed that. And the cabinet resolution explicitly described Jerusalem as, and I quote, an inseparable part of Israel and its eternal capital. Its eternal capital. There was only one opponent of the decision, and that was Chertok. He believed that Israel's hold on Jerusalem wasn't in any danger at all. The UN wasn't going to send a force to occupy Jerusalem. Who was going to come and remove an Israeli policeman from a street on Jerusalem? It was Israel's talk of Jerusalem as capital, he thought, that had provoked the resolution. And the right thing to do was to stay silent. After that cabinet vote and the Knesset vote, Chertok submitted his resignation, first for having failed to see the campaign coming, and second for feeling that he couldn't defend Israel's position. But Ben-Gurion ignored the resignation and persuaded him to stay on. So this vote set Israel on the path of bolstering Jerusalem. Ben-Gurion then mounted a campaign to move Israel's various ministries from Tel Aviv to the capital. By the way, there's only one ministry still there. It's the Ministry of Defense is still in Tel Aviv. Actually, there's a small ministry now of strategic affairs because the defense ministry is there. It's also there. But all the other ministries in the course of the early 50s were moved up from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And that was done in the teeth of international opposition, including the opposition of the United States. And in retrospect, there is no doubt that naming Jerusalem as Israel's capital strengthened Israel's hold on the city. If the Jordanians had done the same thing at the same time, making Jerusalem instead of Amman their capital, because remember, they annexed the West Bank, it would have been impossible for Israel to have united the city in 1967. It would have been an Arab capital. Right? Instead, for political reasons, the Jordanians didn't do that, and thus lost Jerusalem altogether. So I'll end this by provoking you by saying that Ben-Gurion showed the way to Trump. Ben-Gurion had acted defiantly in response to a UN resolution. So did Trump. In his case, it was Security Council Resolution 2334, which the Obama administration had declined to veto, and which demanded that Israel, and I quote, immediately and completely cease all settlement activities in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, end of quote. Now, the notion that the Western Wall and the Jewish Quarter constituted occupied Palestinian territory alarmed Israel's supporters, Jewish and non-Jewish. Trump at the time was president-elect, and Alan Dershowitz, no less, wrote at the time, and I quote him, that Trump can ameliorate the effects of this resolution immediately upon assuming office. He can do so by officially recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving its embassy there. End of quote. It's the same logic as Ben-Gurion in 1949. Just as Ben-Gurion reacted to a UN resolution by creating a controversial fait accompli in Jerusalem, Trump has done the same. So you heard it here first, you probably won't hear it again. Ben-Gurion and Trump mentioned in the same breath for limited purposes only. Now, what can we conclude from these three votes that made Israel? Notice that they all relate to the possession and status of territory. One could put together another list of important votes, not by politicians, but by Supreme Court justices, which have also had a profound impact on Israel, particularly in deciding both its Jewish and democratic character. But the most influential votes by governments have had to do with the territorial extent of the state. And 1948 set three important precedents. First, Israel would claim territory acquired in a war against aggressors. This happened in 1948, and it happened again after 1967. This wasn't something that emerged from the post-1967 settler right. It was a principle established in the very same session of the People's Administration, which concluded by choosing Israel as the name of the state. It goes right back to David Ben-Gurion. Second, Israel would not claim all of the territory west of the Jordan. This was a principle established by the decision not to occupy all of the West Bank in 1948. And it remains a principle of Israeli policy today, both on the right and the left of the spectrum, in principle. But an aspect of that vote actually undermined the principle. And what is it? The fact that the founder of the state, David Ben-Gurion, championed the losing side. His idea of the missed opportunity of 1948 would fuel the drive to recapture that opportunity after 1967, and that we see embodied in the settlement enterprise. And finally, Israel would respond to every challenge to its hold on Jerusalem by doubling down. Israelis don't see Jerusalem as the Zionist city. That's a status reserved for Tel Aviv. But it is Zion. And Ben-Gurion set the precedent for creating facts on the ground in Jerusalem, from the Israeli decision to unite the city in 1967 to Trump's latest move. So the votes of 1948 have had a lasting effect, although reconstructing them isn't entirely straightforward. The amazing thing, however, is that Israel followed democratic procedures from the very outset, even in the midst of a war for its birth and survival. And here I'll allow myself a final personal observation. I mentioned earlier that I came from the study of the Islamic and Arab worlds. In studying those politics, there are no minutes of cabinet debates to study. There are no votes to analyze. There's certainly no instances where the leader is overruled by opponents. Israel may not always make the best decisions, but it adheres to best practices in the way they are made. And it's done so since its very birth. Now, there are many democratic states in the world today. There aren't many, when you think about it, that have been democratic since their very inception. One may or may not like the precedent set by the outcome of these three votes, but the precedent set by the process is a valuable one and counts among Israel's most impressive achievements. Thank you very much.